this. So let me get started. Welcome everybody to this book forum. I'm Louisa Shine. I am an anthropologist of China in Rutgers Anthropology Department and the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department. And I work very closely with programming for the Center for Chinese Studies. For those of you who may be new to our events, the Center for Chinese Studies does a lot of programming, sometimes 2, 3, 4 events a week, sometimes just one. This week we had quite a few. And we'd love to see you online if you're far away. We'd love to host you here if you can make it from the region. We do get a lot of people drive in from around the region. So it's great to see people. I think once you've come to a Zoom event, you're automatically entered on the mailing list. So then you'll hear about our events. But if you want to find them otherwise, just Google Rutgers Center for Chinese Studies and you can see a whole calendar of upcoming things. We'd love to see you. This event is sponsored not only by the Center for Chinese Studies at Rutgers, but also Rutgers Global, the Global Asia's Initiative, and especially the Geography Department from which our speaker hails. In one sense, although I'm about to tell you that Jessie Rodenbiker is also an associate research scholar at Princeton University with the Center on Contemporary China and an assistant teaching professor at geography at Rutgers University. His doctorate is in geography from the University of California, Berkeley, and he is a human environment geographer researching environmental governance, urbanization, and social inequality in China and globally. He is also a 2022-23 Early Career Fellow with the American Council on Learned Societies and a 2022-23 China Fellow at the Wilson Center. Honestly, I've never seen somebody hold so many postdocs and other posts at the same time. I don't know how he does it, but and previously he has served as a Cornell University Atkinson Postdoctoral Research Associate in Sustainability with the Department of Natural Resources and Environment and as visiting scholar at Sichuan University School of Public Administration and Department of Land Resource Management. Wow, that's a mouthful. So with funding from the Jiang Jingguo Foundation, Fulbright, and Social Science Research Council, among others, he has published in the Annals of the American Association of Geographers, GeoForum, Environment and Planning E, Nature and Space, International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, Land Use Policy, and other venues. And we're going to hear today about his first book, which is making quite a splash. This is the second book forum I've gotten to attend, and I'm excited to hear the conversation. Just to let you know that I will introduce our two respondents just before they speak, so you can be a little bit more aware of who you're hearing from. So I will now turn it over to Jessie, and he's already sharing screen. Please let us know if you have a problem with that. You can also enter questions into chat, and at the end of the event, you can let us know somehow, signal or whatever, if you'd like us to read a question from chat rather than have you be called on to ask a question. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Jessie. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Louisa, for that really kind introduction. And thanks also to Yichun, Catherine Chang, and Jiaqing Chen for being here and for engaging with the book as discussants today. Really looking forward to hearing your comments and your readings of the book and to having a larger conversation with everybody in the audience. I'd like to also thank the Department of Geography at Rutgers for all of the support as I wrote this book. I feel very fortunate to have such a generative and supportive set of colleagues here. And I'd also like to thank the Global Asia's Initiative for their support and for co-sponsoring this event today, as well as Rutgers Global. So in a relatively short amount of time, I want to highlight some of the key themes from the book and then pass on the microphone to the discussants so we can have a wider conversation. So I should say on the onset here that the book is published open access with Cornell University Press. So if any part of the book is of interest to you or pertains to your work, I would invite you to download it and take a look at it, at no cost for free. The book takes ecology as an object of inquiry. It argues that ecology has become a means to express and constitute state power. And it examines how the Chinese state wields ecology to govern nature, society, and space. In this context, ecology mediates fields of social action in unequal subject positions within China's citizenry. So to begin to flesh out this argument and situate some of the stories in the book, I want to draw your attention to the cover of the book, which you can see on this slide here. This is a picture of Kunming Waterfall Park in Southwest China, which is one of my field sites. Making this artificial waterfall and environmentally engineering this landscape that surrounds it entailed redirecting the flow of the Yunnan River to go right through the heart of Kunming and flow it through the city to the south. Kunming is the provincial capital of Yunnan province in China's southwest. And part of the idea behind this landscape, as scientists and urban planners explained to me, was that creating this artificial waterfall would accelerate the rate of flow through Lake Dian and help alleviate problems of eutrophication. At the same time, it creates this kind of beautified urban landscape, which increases the value of nearby commercial housing. And you can see some of that in the background there of the image. To make this landscape, the municipal state extended control over land on the outskirts of the city through ecological protection zoning, and they resettled residents into high-rise resettlement complexes, which, if you can see my mouse, are kind of over here outside of the frame. This resettlement process contributes to national plans to urbanize 100 million rural people by the year 2030. So I want to suggest that you can think of this as part of the largest state-directed urbanization program on Earth. So this landscape intervention serves multiple ends. It aims to optimize biophysical relationships in nature, optimize governance of the population, and create a kind of eco-developmental aesthetic. The biophysical, governmental, and aesthetic are three key modes through which state power articulates in relationship to ecology, and this is captured to a degree here in the cover of the book. The Chinese state frames this kind of intervention as integral to building an ecological civilization. Ecological civilization building is an official state term that's written into the CCP Constitution in 2012. I've come to think of it as the Chinese state's attempt to include sustainable development and socio-environmental optimization into party state ideology. In the book, I ask questions about how ecology took on meanings related to sustainable urbanization and civilizational attainment. I ask questions about how ecology shapes state approaches to social and environmental governance, and with what kinds of effects. So there's a couple key practices that I examine in the book that are related to conservation planning and land use optimization. For example, the 2014-2020 New Type Urbanization Plan and ecological redlining policies mandate that 20% of land needs to be demarcated for conservation. So 20%, that's roughly 1/5. That's exactly 1/5. So this is a huge amount of land. So think of this as a large-scale area-based conservation project. This year, that figure shot up to 30% of land. And it shot up because China is trying to align with the new Kunming-Montreal biodiversity framework, which suggests that 30% of land needs to be zoned for conservation by the year 2030. I'm showing you this figure there in the lower right of the UN Biodiversity Conference, where this international agreement was agreed upon, again, framed here as a process of ecological civilization building. So part of my research traced how ecological protection planning extends municipal state governance and precipitates a range of socioeconomic trajectories for rural people whose land and housing are included in conservation. This is the table of contents here for the book. The introduction lays out a framework for analyzing relationships between ecology and state power across these biophysical, governmental, and aesthetic modes. The chapters that make up part 1 focus on relationships between ecology and state power, largely from the perspective of environmental scientists, urban planners, and government officials that participated in the research. These chapters examine the logics and techniques that underlie the state's vision of ecological modernization. Part 2 focuses on uneven social trajectories of everyday citizens, villagers, and ecological migrants as they navigate state environmental policy. The epilogue then considers China's green governance in global contexts. The content for the book comes from mixed methods research that I carried out across 3 Chinese cities that you can see here on this map, Chengdu, Kunming, and Dali. And I have to give a shout out and thanks to Mike Siegel, the cartographer at Rutgers Geography, for helping create this map and some of the other figures that you'll see later in the presentation, which became part of the book. So I chose these cities here because they correspond with the 3 types of cities where ecological protection zoning policies were being implemented. This includes provincial capitals and prefecture level cities, that's Kunming and Chengdu, and also county level towns, so that is Dali. I drew on ethnography and interviews with urban planners, villagers, ecological migrants, government officials, and ecologists. I also conducted historical research across the natural and social sciences, both in archives in the Southwest and in digital archives. And I also used a visual participatory method called photo voice, which essentially entailed villagers taking photos of their housing, land, and environment. And we used these photos as a starting point or a jumping off point for focus group discussions about some of the transitions that they were experiencing as their land and as their housing were being incorporated into these conservation projects. So this mixed method approach was really important for me to develop a sense of the history of ecology in China, how ecological thought came to shape state policies, and how conservation practices then impacted people. So this is what I'm going to talk about. So in the first part of the talk, I'm going to provide a really brief genealogy of how ecological logics formed in China and how they came to take on particular meanings related to sustainable development and social inequality within the population. I'm then going to turn to how these ecological logics shape techniques of conservation planning in contemporary China. I'm going to illustrate how urban-rural conservation planning produces new frontiers of local state land governance. And in the third part, I'm going to discuss how people navigate these state policies. I'm going to highlight some of the uneven socioeconomic trajectories for rural people whose land and housing are incorporated into municipal state conservation projects. In the book, I make the case that eco-developmental logics emerge through reasoned arguments of China's scientists. These logics undergird state techniques that extend power over land and people, and everyday people navigate state policies in ways that reconfigure their lives and reconfigure their livelihoods. So to be clear, the book doesn't portray a kind of juggernaut authoritarian state, but rather one that comes into being through forms of ecological knowledge production, struggles over resources within the local state, and everyday negotiations. Okay, so this is what we'll do in maybe about 20 minutes or so. Okay, part 1. So the point of departure for part 1 is that various meanings surrounding ecology are contingent on social, historical, and political contexts. So to understand how ecology took on meanings, I'm going to walk us through the ideas of some key scientists. Ecology initially came to China through the work and global scientific exchanges of early 20th century botanists like Hu Xiansu and Japanese botanist Miyoshi Manabu, who is pictured here. Miyoshi studied at the University of Leipzig in Germany and was a crucial figure in translating ecology for much of East Asia. In its early iterations within China, ecology came to connote aesthetic relationships between humans and beauty within the botanical world. So this is important to note because this discourse of ecological civilization building is closely tied with the discourse of building a beautiful China. So if you listen to Xi Jinping speak in most venues, he'll be talking about building an ecological civilization while at the same time building a beautiful China. So they appear in the same breath. Ecology came to take on developmental connotations through the work of ecological Marxists and systems scientists. Ma Shijun was one of China's preeminent system scientists. He was also one of the principal authors of the 1987 Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, that came to define sustainability really for decades. In his work, Ma coined what he called the social, economic, ecological complex systems theory, which conceived of nature and society as a complex system to be optimized through scientific management. He laid a foundation for equilibrium and ecology within China and argued that sustainable development could be achieved through these kinds of systems models. So this is one example of one of Ma's systems model. So this was originally published in Chinese and translated and reproduced here for the book. Ma's vision for engineering sustainability, as you can see in this model, involves functional land zoning to maximize efficiency in material circulation and production. Central to the schema are built environments surrounded by functional zones. So you can see agricultural zone, industrial production zones here in natural ecosystem area, etc. Ma's system science approach to planning really proliferated in conjunction with his position as the chairman of the Chinese Ecological Society and advisor for the State Environmental Protection Commission. And this is important for the larger stories in the book because ideas about spatially optimizing land use and optimizing socio-natural relations through urbanizing the rural population really have roots in these kinds of mechanistic logics. Alongside system scientists, agricultural economists, and ecological Marxists argue that sustainable development really hinged on the management of the rural population. And this is one expression of that here in a population land commodity cycle model. So in this model, they express this through positive and negative feedbacks between population control, population quality, flows of capital and rational land use, and various ecological functions. So these kinds of system science logics became embedded in China's state modernization policies that aim to govern the rural population and optimize biophysical relationships in nature. So the important thing here that I want to stress, one of the important things that I want to stress here is that teleological logics of modernist progress underlie this kind of mechanistic thinking. This figure here comes from urban ecologist Wang Rusong, who's actually one of the students of Ma Shijun, who I showed you in a previous image. And in this article, 1999 article, he's arguing that an ecological society is actually at a higher stage of development than a society organized around traditional agriculture. This arrow going from bottom to top underneath there suggests that sustainable development entails a progressive set of steps towards creating an ecological society, by which we can infer a predominantly urban society. So in producing logics like this, Chinese scientists do significant work in making ecology developmental. These logics undergird ecological civilization building as a state project of modernization through socio-natural optimization and transformation of rural society. So one sense of this logic is that biophysical relations can be improved upon through scientific intervention, and that society and nature can achieve an optimized relationship through state-led scientific management. A key practice that emerged from these scientific logics was functional land use planning. And over the 1990s and 2000s, functional land zoning became a really central part of city planning. So here I want to talk a bit more specifically about how municipal conservation planning facilitates state territorialization of land. So it's important to remind people that land in China is a socialized asset, which means that it belongs to the state. However, it's constitutionally and legally underdefined which branches of the state can use and profit from land. This ambiguity precipitates struggles over land control, and various techniques to exercise control over land emerge. So through this slide, I want to explain how municipal governments utilize conservation zoning to extend control over rural land. So take a look at my mouse. I'm going to walk us through a couple of these slides here. So this is something of a conceptual diagram that shows spatial relationships between the city and the countryside. This broad outline here represents a municipal region. This area in the center is what you could think of as the urban core. It's the area that looks and feels like the city. Bunch of tall buildings, closely, densely packed. This is a peri-urban area, or what you could think of as the urban fringe. It's the area where highly dense areas give way to agricultural land, and you start to see a kind of interdigitation of built environments with agricultural land. And then these are rural areas that are within the greater purview of the municipal region. So these are two maps of conservation areas within cities where I conducted research. This map here is Kunming. This map here is Chengdu. The built up area of Kunming, what we could call the urban core, is here. The satellite city of Changchun is right here. And these green areas that you see outside are newly made urban ecological protection areas that overlap with rural land. You can see something similar here. Built up area, urban core of Chengdu here. These green areas are newly made conservation areas that overlap with rural land. So I mentioned earlier in the talk that new type urbanization planning became a means to incorporate rural land in the urban planning process. Now, zoning 20% of municipal regions for ecological protection initially posed a major problem for urban planners because they were already balancing a large number of different land planning quotas. So when they got this, when this came down from the central state, this was essentially viewed as a big headache, another kind of land planning process that needs to be balanced. So for example, planners need to follow a number of different central state policies like the Zhengjian Guangkou policy, which links up any relative increase in urban construction land with a relative decrease in rural construction land. So what I found through all of my interviews is that urban planners approach this problem of zoning 20% of land for ecological protection through multifunctional land zoning. In urban-rural planning, urban planners zoned land with overlapping functions, wherein an ecological function could overlap with another function, such as tourism. Designating these overlapping functions became a technique by which municipal governments responded to central state mandates for ecological protection and extended control over land. Multifunctional zoning allows municipal governments to intervene by leasing or purchasing land from villagers within this greater municipal region. And then they undertake a process of planned resettlement. So this is a conceptual diagram made for the book that details what this looks like in practice. And thanks again to cartographer Mike Siegel and various faculty who weighed in as this was being produced. So again, you can see here the urban core at the center, the urban fringe on the outside. These white patterned areas represent newly made ecological protection areas. And then these squares organized in a rectangle are newly made resettlement housing. So you can see rural housing is being spatially concentrated through resettlement and farmlands being transformed according to ecological functions written into the urban-rural comprehensive plan. Now, because local finances are quite limited, city governments enroll organizations to build on and manage land. City officials referred to this process as assigning organizational responsibility. This process simultaneously consolidates control over rural land and disperses that land control to organizations who help finance and manage ecological protection land. The types of organizations involved include private companies, state-owned enterprises, and government bureaus that are within the municipal government hierarchy. So this image that I'm showing you here is an example of an ecological protection area, and it can give you a sense of how these organizations that are involved are capitalizing on their involvement. You can see these boats here in the foreground. They rent out for about $300 an hour. In the background, you can see newly made commercial housing built within the boundaries of the ecological protection area. And of course, this area used to house a number of natural villages who've since gone through a process of resettlement that made way for this form of conservation-oriented development. So in the book, I call this ecological territorialization, a process that essentially connotes an ensemble of spatial techniques through which power over natural resources is exercised either in the name of environmental protection or socio-natural optimization. And in this case, and in this example, the resource that I'm talking about is land. So through ecological protection zoning and assigning responsibility for conservation financing, construction, and management, land use rights move from villagers to state and corporate organizations, and land control moves from township governments to municipal government hierarchies. Municipal governments can generate revenues from this process also through land transaction fees. They also consider this as a way of improving rural society through spatially optimizing land and housing. So it took me about 3 years or so of interviewing urban planners and government officials to understand this process that I'm showing you here and simplifying in this diagram. And I recall one instance when a state planner brought out the comprehensive urban rural plan. Of course, this isn't a kind of document that you can just download from the internet or find anywhere, but it's something that's internal to the state. He took out the plan, unrolled it, unfurled it across the table, and pointed to a couple of villages that are located inside a newly made conservation zone. And he said, I quote, "The village and the city aren't the same. The city's concentrated like this, but villages, they're really dispersed. Their surface area is wide, and up until now, they've not matured. Regarding this form of governance, it's not only a plan, it's a structure of the city and the countryside in which we take the dispersed areas and concentrate them vertically. We move villages to a point. We take dispersed built areas and concentrate them through ecological migration. With this kind of comprehensive planning and planned construction, their living situation improves." So this quote, end quote. So this quote illustrates something about how urban planners understand the unequal relationships between the city and the countryside, and how they understand the role of ecological protection zoning and resettlement. They consider this process of concentrating villagers through resettlement as a form of socio-environmental improvement and one that's really necessary for sustainable development. Yet, as municipal states extend control over rural land, villagers are unevenly displaced, and they experience a range of different socioeconomic trajectories. As land is incorporated into conservation areas, rural people often lose access to their agricultural land, and they face the prospect of resettlement. So this is a photo taken by a peri-urban villager that took part in my photo voice research. So she brought this photo into a focus group discussion, and she explained that this was a photo that she had taken of her. Excuse me. And in this photo, she's working as a day laborer on someone else's land. So since her land was incorporated into one of these newly made conservation areas, she no longer has access to her own agricultural land and started to sell her labor as a daily agricultural worker. At the same time, she obtains annual payments for her rural land from the government because it's part of the lease that she has for the conservation project. So she and others like her used photos like this one to discuss some of their experiences of losing access to rural land and what effects it had on their life and labor. And part of what she and others emphasized, and indeed one of the key findings that I write about in the book, is that the politics of land and housing valuation really shape different socioeconomic trajectories. And I want to give you, talk about a couple of the different kinds of land and housing valuation to kind of help illustrate this point. So imagine with me for a minute that these two boxes right here represent a 2-story village house. And these outline boxes above and below represent potential forms of housing valuation. And then this rectangle in the center is land. The box at the top represents what's called sky fees. Sky fees entail the valuation of yet unbuilt vertical housing space. So this is literally a valuation of the air above the house where there isn't a built structure in relationship to the housing materials and the floor space. So in some cases of resettlement, this is valuated, and in other cases, it's not. Similarly, subsurface housing fees are another form of compensation for the area beneath the house. Like sky fees, it's not a built addendum, but literally the ground upon which the house rests. In some cases, it's valued. In other cases, it isn't. Another form of valuation is what's called transition fees. These are monies that are paid in monthly installment for the time between when villagers move out of their original village home, but not yet into a resettlement housing. So like sky fees and transition fees, this is tabulated in relationship to the villager's original housing space. Land sales and land leases and the prices that are associated with these are also key factors shaping transitions. So I'm going to walk us through just a couple of examples to illustrate how these volumetric measures come to matter in shaping inequality and shaping villagers' aspirations for upward socioeconomic mobility. As rural land is zoned for ecological protection, most villagers are relocated to high-rise resettlement complexes like this one that I'm showing you here. This is an image of a resettlement complex in North Kunming that ecological migrants called the refugee district. And they refer to it as the refugee district because of the relatively low levels of compensation that they receive for resettlement and the poor quality of resettlement housing. Residents in the refugee district were compensated for both land and housing jointly, with just one 50-meter apartment unit and monthly compensation payments that are equivalent of roughly $85 a month. And they were to receive this for a 20-year period. So this fell far below their housing and land's market value and is right around the amount of the national low-income subsidy. They described their experience as one of moving into high-rise poverty. But in contrast with this example, many other villagers fare economically well through land and housing displacement, a process that they refer to as moving into riches. Banfuyo was the Chinese language term that they would use to describe this moving into riches process. So this image on the left here is of a village housing contract with 6 floors, all tabulated for compensation, as you can see here. In this image on the right is a model of new development underway. You can see that there's, this is actually the other side. If you think about the cover of the book that I showed you in the initial image, this is part of the Kunming Waterfall Park. This is some of the apartments that you could see in the background. And these are newly built apartments, both for sale on the market and resettlement concentration way back here. So again, this used to be a site of multiple villages who are going through a process of resettlement to a different area back there in spatially concentrated housing. So Zhang is one example of a peri-urban villager turned urban landlord. His village obtained a good price for land and housing. They received sky fees and subsurface fees that were paid in the form of high-rise resettlement housing. So altogether, his family came to own 15 apartment units in the resettlement complex. Zhang rents out more than half of these extra apartment units for a profit. So in his rural to urban resettlement transition, Zhang took on rentier status, moving into the housing managerial sector. In the book, I referred to examples like this as accumulation through displacement, because some villagers experience upward socioeconomic mobility through conservation-oriented displacement and resettlement. So I'm just going to provide 2 more examples of inequality in the displacement process, and then I'm going to pass the microphone on to the discussants. So this is a picture of Wang Jie. He's a multi-generational peasant who fished and farmed his entire life until his land was incorporated into an urban ecological protection area. To make a living without land, he transformed his house into a rural-themed restaurant. It's a kind of space where he represents rural characteristics in food and service provisioning, as well as performance. In addition to this, he touts for tourists who come to the conservation area to take on what he calls traditional fishing excursions. And this image that I'm showing you here is what you could see maybe from the vantage point of the tourist if you were with Wang on one of these fishing excursions. So in the book, I write about how villagers produce a rural ecological sublime as they perform rural differences in these ecological protection areas. Performing rural imaginaries has become part of Wang's daily routine. So without land, he performs rurality for predominantly urban tourists. So in doing this, he creates a kind of class-differentiated representation of rural life in the landscape of his own dispossession. He does this in part because he feels like it's his only option. Without access to farmland and awaiting resettlement, which for Wang has taken several years, he feels like his best option is to earn a living, is to perform rural nature for tourists. As we sat in his living room, he held up several photos that he took at the ecological protection site that was built on his former land. And he said, I quote, "The ecology has been built beautifully, but our ability to continue to exist has been greatly affected. Our houses are going to be demolished. They've labeled our village a slum. They've taken over our land and built a beautiful ecological landscape. Many people have had their ways of life seized by their ecology. It's already stripped us of our ability to subsist. So here I'm highlighting ecology again as an aesthetic and the dynamism between an eco-developmental and rural ecological aesthetic. So this example and some of the others that I've been highlighting here in this third part of the talk illustrates some of the uneven trajectories for those who become part of China's 100 million urbanizing rural people. So there are also instances of resistance to resettlement. And in the book, I highlight the role of infrastructural removal in delimiting forms of resistance. So this is the last example I'm going to talk about. And in this example, I'm going to bring attention to the role of partial demolition in limiting collective resistance to resettlement. So this image here is of a village house that was partially torn apart by a demolition bureau. You can see that there's clothes that are being hung in the foreground there to dry, items that are being stored in the background. So this is still a space that is being used and still a space that's being lived in. In the book, I read about how this village had come together to collectively resist resettlement. They met with techniques of partial infrastructural demolition like this. Other villages experienced something similar with infrastructural services cut off. So think about having your electricity cut off, your water cut off, sanitation services cut off. And these techniques of infrastructural removal then take effect on a community over time. Over time, villagers grew tired of living in a landscape of detritus. They grew tired of living without basic services, and their solidarity weakened. Household by household, many slowly began to accept resettlement. There are, of course, those who continue to reside here, but partial demolition has had the effect of dismantling collective forms of resistance. So this is another way in which aesthetics comes to figure into governance and delimit forms of collective counterconduct. So again, these are just some of the themes and some of the movements that take place in the book. There's more that we can say about it, but I'm not going to tie things up very neatly. Rather, I'm going to keep them open and pass the microphone on to the discussants, Catherine and Jiaqing. I'm really looking forward to hear what you have to say and to have a larger conversation. So I'll leave it there and say thanks to everyone for coming.
Thank you, Jesse. Now I'm unmuted. And that was extremely lucid. For those of you who have not read any of the book yet, I really encourage you. Jesse has just informed us that it's open access. So at least a chapter. He's a wonderful storyteller, but also a very sophisticated parser of policy and scholarship around these things. And the blend is quite amazing. Wonderful writing too. He nails the short to the point sentences in a way I've never been able to do, and I'm always very impressed. But it's not for any lack of sophistication. So I don't want to take any time. I want to go right into, I will be introducing the respondents as right in front of their response so that you'll know who you're hearing from. So I'm going to start with, oh, sorry, the wrong notes. With Catherine. And Catherine Zhang is an urban and economic geographer who has been a member of the McAllister Geography Department since 2015. Catherine received her BA and Master's in Geography from National Taiwan University and PhD in Geography, Environment, and Society from the University of Minnesota. Her research interests include global urbanism, urban sustainability, policy mobilities, and East Asia. And her scholarship uses qualitative methods to research the political economy of eco-city initiatives. She's used 2 newly built Chinese eco-cities as case studies to examine their spatio-temporal variegations and the translocal policy mobilities in relation to Shanghai, Tianjin, London, and Singapore. Her publications include Actually Existing Sustainabilities in Sustainability, the Journal of Record, and Failure Matters in Environment and Planning A, Economy and Space. So welcome, Catherine, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Louisa. That's a wonderful introduction, and also thank you, Jessie, for inviting me to be actually going to respond to this book. I really, really enjoy reading this book for several reasons. One is that the writing is definitely beautiful, and all the cases that you are well presented with such a very rich materials. So the book basically, Jessie actually works on the eco states. It actually has a way longer history than just now and think about China. Indeed, the idea about eco-state probably actually kind of came out for people's kind of take people's attention roughly around a decade ago. So one of the kind of grounded piece was the eco-state restructuring piece that's written by Adam Weil, Andrew Jonas, and David Gibbs back in 2010. And back to them really is actually kind of a strong effort that scholars actually try to understand how state manages the environment for sustainable development. So you need to actually go on with a series of transitions of the state capacity and with various actually regulatory kind of strategic changes actually into those institutions. But back to them, indeed, after that work actually came out, people start to wonder, those are wonderful discussions about the state transitions, but majority of those discussions actually came out based upon the experiences in the global north and the west. So also a group of Asian scholars start to think that, well, how could we really envision this eco-state in a global south or global east context? So coming from there, there's also a group of scholars who are working on this kind of specific line of topic. For example, George Lin and Fulong Wu, they focus on the regulatory transitions and the influences on the urban planning regime at a national level, specifically in China. And also include myself that I use the eco-cities as a way to explore the eco-state restructuring processes, right? So those kind of group of those work. And Jessie's work really actually kind of stand pretty well kind of on those actually kind of previous work and really well situated in those eco-state debates. And then what actually kind of even more impressive is that situated with that within that debate, but Jessie actually put a step further to detail the mechanisms of how the eco-state operates on the ground and kind of across all different scales. So Jessie actually started with his inquiry in this book about the eco-state from tracing the genealogy of systematic science and that kind of thinking. How does that thinking inform the planning region, the governance region at the national level? And this is one of a kind of a typical step for the people who do STS, right? Kind of engage with that, but it's not actually a typical stance for kind of earlier group when actually for people work on the eco-state restructuring group, working on specifically on that actually kind of structural national level inquiries. So with this one, Jessie successfully teasing out how the system science thinking influences the functional land zoning for ecological civilization, and the strong beliefs that in ecological society should be urban society that influence whole how the kind of eco-state operates and the way try to actually push all that kind of rural China become urban China. From there, Jessie further to actually kind of link that higher level thinking, philosophical thinking, to how the planning region operates. And basically through that, Jessie actually say this is actually kind of use the idea of aesthetic politics, aesthetic planning region, thinking that ecology as a pristine nature or ecology as a technically enhanced nature project. That's with that beautification effort, but really actually kind of technologically enabled, kind of beautiful, pristine that kind of ecology as a way, as a goal to lead to that's actually kind of ecological conservation, ecological zoning, ecological planning, all sorts of projects actually come out from that. And not such a aesthetic planning region operates on the ground, also through various kind of territorialization projects. Those territorialization projects control the land that's actually come to the actually kind of the heart of the China's urban planning region, how it operates. And it's actually kind of the techniques is actually being kind of used and kind of employed is the urban rural master plans. And those actually kind of to make sure that you can operate, implement those urban rural master plans, as actually Jesse earlier reviewed for us, you actually need to do an additional kind of techniques, including consolidation through those multifunctional zonings to consolidate and use the quotas actually to figure out the land and from the rural area, get the control of there and change those kind of rural land to become urbanized. And it also about the dispersion of the development and management functions to various organizations and entities, so that it's actually make it more than just that municipal capacity, and you actually link to be alliances and a kind of a series of movement for those entities involved, to all of them actually kind of with a kind of and the same goal towards the ecological development. So to this point, Jesse's book is pretty actually focused on the larger scale, national scale kind of mechanism, but of course how that's actually kind of realized gradually to the ground. But it's not just actually that structural perspective being provided. In the second part of the book, Jesse not only seen the ecosystem from that structural perspective, but he further explores how people's livelihoods are influenced and also interact with the ecosystem in the planning processes. So to speak, it's an effort to explore that structural Asian processes, right? And in that, but definitely the space is the source of violence. So the ecosystem here use all sorts of the micromanagement strategies that could be ruthless, right? And in a way that it demonstrates how that's also the differences of those micro kind of strategies being used actually kind of manifest differently across places, and therefore people's experiences vary across China in that case. Nevertheless, it also doesn't mean those people from the residents on the development kind of eco-development kind of zones, they are just the passive victims of those developmental projects. Local residents actually could be active and actively participate in that processes and demonstrate their agencies, either through resistance, that's counter conduct, or negotiations with the planning regimes. And this is actually the process which actually JC captures through the concept of volumetric policies. And that volumetric practice, I think one of the most important findings is that really some of those residents are able to, accumulate wealth through exploit the compensation scheme and kind of really in that way to achieve upward socioeconomic kind of status, kind of mobility, right? And that's actually the idea Jesse earlier also actually reviewed for us, this idea he actually calls the accumulation through displacement. This is indeed something has been found in many of actually kind of scholars across China in all sorts of development. So not only eco-related development, but all other developments as well, and also in my own work too. I call this is a process I call accumulation by relocation, for example. No matter which one, how we call it, it's really demonstrate that agency, that under that super mighty, and powerful China kind of a national state and state kind of planning regime, people on the ground, they are still able to resist and negotiate with that state power and make changes and differences and practice differently in their livelihoods. And this finding really actually significantly challenges the understanding of livelihood transition during the land dispossession processes based upon the global north and west experiences. Only imagine they are the losers. Indeed, they may not be. So they actually possibly, as actually Jesse said, they actually can go rich because of that urbanization effort of the rural land and through those compensation schemes. And those actually that kind of displacement, kind of accumulation through displacement, they also go through different routes, right? So Jesse further try to explore that in what way of those people's structural position or their different interactions, how would that actually kind of cause those kind of paths and transition toward different directions. in which one of that important thing is the differentiated aesthetic emplacement of rural life in their daily living and livelihood practices, which counter the state's logic of ecological optimization zoning techniques aiming to urbanize those rural kind of populations. So all of those part of actually kind of findings demonstrate the possibility and that interaction between the structure and the kind of people on the ground, that agency. And that is in some way is one I see as one actually wonderful move. And many actually post-colonial scholars, for example, actually support to look actually from the ground and then we envision the kind of state, the eco state in China. So to end with my comment, I want to keep it relatively short so that we can open up for more questions and discussions. But I see with this actually wonderful work, what I actually kind of end with, I want to actually think about what could we do, right? So we would stand upon this wonderful work. What would be the next step? And what are the things we can develop further from here? What does actually justice work kind of can inform us for future research directions, for example? So one thing which I've been thinking about is really through that agency-oriented kind of lens, you know. So the idea about accumulation through displacement, or for example, in my own words, is the kind of accumulation by relocation. But no matter how we call this is actually kind of idea capture the everyday speculation efforts that people use in their daily life. It's really approach the speculation from different perspectives, from thinking speculation through the global capital sense, through the actually kind of wide kind of political economic kind of economy perspective, thinking about those circulations of capitals within cities of land, right? This is that daily practices in the daily livelihood. They engage with that speculation, aiming for finding a better life, aiming for a better livelihood for themselves. There's a similar findings actually being found, not only, for example, in my cases of the eco-cities in Shanghai and Tianjin, but also in other people's work across global South and East. For example, Ari Shepard, Helga Leitner, Binay Gadmani, Michael Goldman, Carol Opadeja, they work actually on Bungalow and Jakarta, for example. They actually also show very similar findings, especially those cases in the kampuns in Jakarta. Those are specifically clear. So it's actually kind of warrants a possibility, you know, to do a comparative research for us to really think about how could those everyday speculations done by residents, right, in a minor scale, you know, on their just livelihood, their houses, right, their front yard, their backyard, their kind of a height of that building, all those actually kind of practices, PT practices. How those actually kind of speculation in those their everyday practice, everyday encounterings help us understand the urbanization process more broadly. So those is kind of one thing I actually can be thinking about, and this really actually kind of will be have actually kind of potential to bring China, right, to be in conversation with other post-colonial groups, actually kind of scholars who are working on other actually cities in the global South, global East, and to actually form a conversation. Because kind of traditionally, scholars who work in kind of urban China or cities in China, people don't necessarily participate in those post-colonial discussions outside of China. Right? So this actually is a possibility to form a wider kind of framework and a wider perspective. Another thing is that in Jesse's actually kind of concluding thoughts for this book, he mentioned several things about for us to think about China's eco-state. So one thing really came to my mind is to examine China's eco-state, the extraterritoriality of it. So at this point, we start to see China actually rise to the leadership of global environmental governance. To what extent the current eco-state can exercise its power and its planning logic beyond its own territory? Or in what kind of situation that engagement globally will kind of reversely influence the practice China actually right now does in its own territory? This is something which I find very interesting and fascinating, especially thinking about China's right now heavily kind of engaged in kind of African urban development, right? Sustainable development, and those actually kind of outside in developing countries, also Latin America, and some part of actually South Asia. So in that sense, how does that influence the China's eco-state, right? And would actually kind of morph to differently, and how does that influence kind of domestic practices versus actually global kind of practices? So that actual territoriality of China's eco-state definitely something which I would hoping based on Jesse's work, and we can further explore later. So that would be my primary thoughts about this book, and then hopes for future scholarships. And then we'll pass my time back to Lisa and Jesse.
Took me a minute to unmute. Sorry about that. Thank you, Catherine. I will now turn over to Jiaqing for an introduction and then comments. Just a couple reminders if people came on late, we are recording. And secondly, if you want to, when you think of it, enter a question into chat, we can come back to this after we get into discussion. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jiaqing Chen, who is an urban development and environmental studies researcher and assistant professor in the Department of Global Studies at the UC Santa Barbara, where he is also affiliated with the Department of Geography and Environment and Society program. That's a PhD program. Dr. Chen received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in city and regional planning with a designated emphasis in global metropolitan studies. His interests span climate justice, global energy transitions, political industrial ecology, urbanization, and infrastructure. Currently, his focus is on China's role in shaping the global green economy and the spread of Chinese planning expertise through its international development activities. He also has professional experience in social movements and organized labor, and is an environmental fellow of the Robert and Patricia Switzer Foundation. His publications include Sustainable Territories in Human Geography and Recasting the Rural in Geoforum. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Jiaqing. Thank you.
Thank you, Louisa. And thank you, Jesse, for inviting me, and Catherine for those wonderful comments. That's a review you can definitely publish, I think, just in its current form. I'll keep my comments very brief, and especially following on Jesse's wonderful encapsulation of the book and Catherine's very scholarly review of the scholarly context and really key questions that are woven throughout the book. For me, one of the really powerful things, I mean, despite having studied these same processes and in some similar cases, I really have learned so much from the book, and I really appreciate that it's here and that we get to engage with it. I really found that, for me, one of the most powerful and troubling questions that emerges from the book, and in my own thinking about my cases and ongoing work in these areas, is the tension between and the kind of grounding of ecological states, as Jesse's really evocatively given us this kind of multi-layered concept and conceptualization, how this teleological vision of modernization, undergirded by fundamental questions of the place of life and the politics of confronting ecological problems, but always in this kind of anthropocentric way, how the forms of kind of revolutionary ecologization or ecological governance are set upon the landscape and created both with this kind of Leviathan state capacity and vision of modernization, but at the same time, that the kind of revolutionary rupture, the ability to do something so quickly and in so many kind of decisive dimensions of social and ecological transformation is really so unevenly distributed, right? In which the ecology and the environment itself, the landscape, becomes the actual medium for social change. It's so disturbing and visceral in so much of the book. I'll just quote for a moment. I think Jesse, both Louisa and Catherine have pointed to Jesse's way with words, and it's very theoretically nuanced and layered language, but at the same time, gives you something very clear conceptually with which to think. He calls ecology, or he gives us this theoretical approach to ecology that he says is not merely the study of relations between living organisms and physical environments, but also a multimodal signifier within and through which nested relations between state, society, and nature articulate. And with this, it's a complex sentence, but Jesse provides us a model methodology for studying such complex and imbricated processes of social and ecological change across many scales. And in the context of a history of ideas, but then also varied terrains of practice. Jesse gives us a really incredible model of coherence between the theoretical conception of the problem of ecological states, his particular research questions, its sites of observation, and his techniques for finding and then illuminating a rich array of empirics. And later, I'm going to ask him for his funding applications as an instrument for teaching my own grad students. I particularly appreciate his tightly woven historical and ethnographic approach to tracing the itineraries of key figures as they traverse this highly varied terrain that he documents. Ecological scientists, social scientists, social scientists of social and ecological change, of rural economy, of national development economy, government officials and planners, and of ecological migrants. Jesse's work takes place in this timely moment when that phrase, ecological migrants, begins to have salience among people's everyday experiences. And it's an important snapshot of a transitory way of life that is now being eclipsed, but yet kind of baked in to what the rural evolves into in China as it faces this massive process of urbanization and a remaking of the rural. In the first pages of the book, Jesse gives us this incredible scene of a man named Zhang performing in almost as a marionette, almost. As he, in this scene, recapitulates or reanimates himself to perform songs and dance that upheld the Maoist campaign. That was a kind of cultural work, part of a campaign to transform the landscapes around his village, to fill in a lake. It highlights this embodiment of ecological state-making processes and their very visceral and affective experiences. And I said it was almost as a marionette. I mean, it's this person. It's the scene is just so striking. But that word "almost" I use is very key because Jesse is careful to highlight the agency of Zhang and others as they persist and resist such processes of world making, although maybe in very constrained, as he indicated in his own summary, constrained by the physical and social processes around them. They yet find new ways through to adapt their lives. And even as an apparently totalizing power to reshape even memories of hardship into kind of forms of a nostalgia, as the meaning of transformation of these places is refracted through the massive and rapid changes in people's lives and landscapes, Zhang himself is able to kind of remake his sense of belonging. And in this way, this ethnographic approach really blurs any lines between what Marx highlights as tragedy and farce in the kind of cycle of domination and exploitation. Jesse provides a very nuanced and detailed account of the development of forms of ecological thinking and applied practice in the context of the state and politics, as Catherine highlighted as a really classic and model form of STS. He shows the consistencies and changes in how the state has thought about and campaigned around transcending ecological limits through social mobilization and technology, and the kind of dialogical processes that those unfold. And then how these discursive practices of the state oscillate between kind of revolutionary rupture, that is transcendence, right, of the Maoist rural-driven revolution, that it would become the basis for actual industrialized communism, right? But that there's an oscillation between this revolutionary rupture and the linearly staged modernization theory, and that the state relies on as its form of goal setting and shaping of a leapfrogging national development. At the same time, his account shows how the state, in quotes, is not a monolith, and that its projections of ecology and life and the various, across the varied physical sites and social terrains of ecological construction produce very uneven and unplanned effects. These he takes up in the second part of his book, where he explores the transitory forms of rural life, that is, as people face demolition and a remaking of the landscapes that they've lived in for generations, and have seen a kind of vacillation of what the state designates as the beautiful and the good life. Excuse me. He really highlights how that although they're transitory, these forms of landscape and kind of adaptation have real implications for people's lives going forward, not just as they adapt, but for the intergenerational processes that might unfold. And so he looks at these forms of life as they're constrained both socially and physically by the environment in new ways, on the physical fringes of ecological construction, as in partially demolished and infrastructurally evacuated villages that are still, as people find new sites of farming on interstitial spaces, and as sort of, James Scottian forms of rightful resistance, they're at the same time far outside the efforts of rural reconstruction that Wen Tiejun and other proponents advocate. Jesse really tracks, I think, a grounded account of a form of atomization and alienation that transforms the rural from a tightly knit form of place and community belonging and national belonging into a transition that sets the ground for new forms of modernization that are predicated on capitalist atomization and alienation. And yet, in this midst, he gives us accounts of small instances of resistance and reconfigured forms of what we might still call subsistence. This is really reminiscent for me of the work of an anthropologist, Bridget Gwarowski, in what she refers to as wayfinding in her study of the intersections of war and wetland restoration ecology in Iraq. And this kind of view, a way that Jesse allows us to understand ecological states, not just in the Chinese context, but in a global context, specifically in relationship to China's role in shaping global ecological futures, which he turns to in the conclusion, but also just in terms of his methodological and theoretical and conceptual apparatus that allows us to raise really important questions. And so I'll end with what I think is the broader challenge of the book and what he turns to in the final pages. And that is, as China's role, as Catherine really highlighted, in shaping global ecological futures has this extraterritorial dimension, but also in forms of expertise. We see that China has become a leader, and as it rises to face and explicitly create policy around daunting challenges, that it has set its really formidable capacities against in terms of sustainability and energy transition, dealing with climate change, and so on, all amidst kind of doubling down and reconfiguring its own internal economy around ecological resource questions, including national autarky around grain, right? It's going to stop, they're setting forth plans to stop importing soy now, right? After having let it go for a decade, and the consequences of that being transformation of landscapes across the Southern Cone. I think Jesse's book asks us to ask how much the forms of resistance and what Jesse calls counterconduct, prefigured and constrained, and shaped not in a two-way dialectic, but in a top-down projection of ecological states. A constraint on the horizons of social ecological imaginations that is both a mirage of seeing like a state scientist and a series of structural changes that reconstitute the social spatial distribution of life and livelihood, and thereby the very terms of citizenship and belonging, not only within the nation, but in the broader world. Thank you.
Thank you, Jiaqing. This time I'm unmuted. So we have only a little over 15 minutes. We have people online and a few questions in the chat. Let me just say you have three options. You can turn your video on and physically raise your hand. You can use the hand raise function, or you can put a question in chat, and then I will check in with you to see if you're here to say it in person. But let me first ask you, Jesse, is there anything you urgently want to respond to, or shall we go straight to other interludes?
Thank you for those brilliant comments. I will probably hold off for now so we can field some questions, but if time allows, I can maybe come back and respond to some of these major points in the comments. But I think there's 3 or 4 maybe already out there, and maybe more to come. What's your sense, Louisa?
Yeah, no, let me ask first if anyone who's here online but may need to go. Let me ask you guys first, because we have some questions in the chat, but if I see any raised hands, I will go to you. Mazen? Oh, I think you're muted. Are you?
I unmuted.
Oh, there you are. Okay, great.
Yep.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this. It's nice to see old friends and new ones. If they say you can't judge a book by its title, but if you can judge it by its introduction, this is a tremendous accomplishment, Jesse. It's really very rich, and as Jiaqing said, it's quite nuanced. It's very clear, and I hope to be able to read it all one day. But the introduction itself just gives a wonderful picture of the whole project, which is really, really tremendous. My question is a little bit tangential, and you can say it's irrelevant if you want, but I couldn't but marvel at the morphological similarity between the urbanization of the countryside that you describe here and Le Corbusier's project from the 1930s, La Ville Radieuse, or l'unité d'habitation. And I think there's more than morphological similarity, which is like even the rationale behind Le Corbusier's project was to reunite man. Women didn't yet exist in 1930s Europe, of course, to reunite man with a well-ordered environment, which strikes very similarly to the project that you describe here, and in very broad terms, of course. And I was wondering why this particular form, but also why at this moment. I remember when I read Lefebvre, especially The Survival of Capitalism, the book preceding the production of space. These are the kinds of projects that I had in mind when he was talking about the urbanization as the reproduction of social relations of production. And I was wondering if there's any kind of perhaps the historical similarity between the survival of capitalism in Europe in the 1930s and post-war period, especially, and this particular point in China's capitalist history, that they resort to this to urbanization as this secondary circuit of the circulation of capital, as how we put it, but also if the form itself has any particular significance.
Can you talk a little bit more about the forms in Le Corbusier's project? I can think about them. Yeah,
I have an image. I don't know how to
Sure.
send images here, but I'm gonna try to like drop a JPEG in the. But this the concentration of living in high rises that exist
sure.
in the middle of a kind of a like well-ordered environment, like designed to the T, basically.
That's true.
I'm gonna, if you can just, I'm gonna try to pull up
Sure.
the
Yeah, you tried to send it. Maybe I'll say some things about it in the meantime. Thanks, Mazen, for this this question. I think you can think of a lot of similarities between this project, as you've described it. I'm less familiar with it, and some of the processes of sociospatial optimization that are taking place within Greater China, and especially around the kind of urban fringe and rural areas within the greater municipal region. I'm not 100% sure, but I think James Scott writes about this as one of the examples in his book, Seeing Like a State, around processes of state simplification and modernization of state power. So this is one way I think where there's kind of some definite similarities or commonalities between these cases. I think something that, so at a very basic level, I think the rationality of modernization through urbanization is something that kind of moves across both of these examples. But I think maybe a point of contrast or differentiation might be that within the Chinese context, the orientation is one of socio-environmental optimization through getting through essentially mechanizing these relationships. So it isn't merely the aesthetic optimization of space and the biophysical optimization of space, but having a full plan that incorporates all of those different aspects. So for a given site, like the one that I showed on the cover of the book, you would have a long protracted process of measuring local carrying capacities, making all of the multifunctional land zones correspond and correlate in such a way that you would achieve this form of socio-environmental optimization. I can't say to what effect that was also the case within Le Corbusier's plan, but it strikes me as maybe one point of differentiation between these types of modernist visions. And at least within the book, one of the things that I aim to do is to provide a kind of theorization of ecological states that moves across a couple of different modalities. So the biophysical, the governmental, and the aesthetic are some of the kind of key modes. And I think at least in the maybe 1930s Europe, maybe at least two of those modes are in play, the governmental and the aesthetic. I'm not sure to what degree the biophysical is also part of that. So maybe I'll leave it there. Yeah, thank you.
Yichun, you look like you want to respond,
Just a quick.
but I think you're okay. Now we
Yeah.
can hear.
Just a quick kind of response to it. So this actually come from, well, I couldn't actually speak for all the cases, but at least from early young research about EQ cities and my part of this, and then part of this actually being influenced indeed by Singapore's way of thinking about what kind of housing kind of arrangement will be the best for the so-called eco-development. Okay, so this is actually kind of a multiple rounds of policy learning between China and Singapore about how we can actually settle a way of actually housing kind of design that can actually put the most of population in, but still efficient enough to achieve a couple of things. So ecological function is one thing, but also about financial sustainability. So this actually comes with that volume, actually the volume politics, right? Volumetric politics. The higher of the buildings, the more possible sales you can make, and therefore you will be able to sustain and finance those ecological projects on the site. So this actually comes with a series of consideration coming from early on thinking about so-called ecologically friendly housing, kind of low levels, right? And fitting in so-called lower kind of carrying capacity to the point that you try to actually aggregate them and do as high as possible in order to actually maximize the profit, but also maximize ecological function outside the housing areas. That's actually transition basically came across China roughly, I would say, around the mid-2010s. So this is a bunch of learning going on and a bunch of the policy mobility goes on, and that informs the way how people design so-called eco-apartments, eco-communities. So this is a part of the story go with that. Then the question would actually should go to ask, why does a radiant city kind of design influence a Singaporean public housing, right? And how does that kind of travel across to China? So this is my way of understand that question and some response from my empirical understanding of China.
Thanks, Catherine, for adding that. Yeah, I think that also speaks to the kind of second part of your question there, Mazen, thinking about how capitalism continues within this particular moment in China. And one of the things that I try to do largely in chapter 3 of the book is talk about how these forms of eco-developmental processes have become institutionalized, and both as part of the kind of banal bureaucratic processes through which municipal states extend control over rural areas, but also a new kind of mode through which they're able to capture land rents. The previous, if you think back to maybe 2000s to 2010s, the Kaifa-Chu, the development zone, was one of the ways in which municipalities did this. There were some rulings against them around 2010 or 2011. And now this ecological protection zoning within the urban rural comprehensive plan and the forms of ecological migration, resettlement, and new housing are part of those processes through which municipalities continue to generate land rents. And Catherine and Jiaqing and others have written about this too. Yeah.
Can I add one very quick remark?
Sure.
It's very interesting you mentioned the migrants, because in at least the case of France, these projects became the hotbeds of the banlieue, where all the North African and Sub-Saharan African migrants became concentrated. So they destroyed a few buildings in the last 10 years. In 2014, I think there was one, 2005 also, which were socialist ideals, but then transformed into what municipalities or governments saw as quasi slums, where all the unwanted social elements were concentrated. And they transformed from this kind of ideal to kind of dystopian, politically and racially charged concentrations. Anyway, thanks.
So, Katarzyna,
Jiaqing has their
are
hand
you-
up too.
what's that?
It looks like Jiaqing has
comment
their
on the same
Oh, I'm
conversation,
sorry.
but we can move on. No, not at all. No, it's totally fine. We can move on. I think I just had a minor comment to add, but we can move on. There's so many other.
We are running out of time, and Katarzyna, I believe, has put 2 questions in the chat. Are you there? Would you like to speak in person, or should I speak for you? Go ahead.
Good evening, and I think you will speak better than I would do it. So, and that's the question and one short comment. So,
You want me to read
yes,
it?
well,
Okay, let's see if
yeah,
I
of
got
course.
it.
How would you place ecological urbanization and modernization concept, as China is both a communist socialist state and also a developmental state, but it's also peculiar in context of 2 types of states that have this very strong modernization agenda. And the second one is that cultural background, because you, of course, emphasized, it was fantastic, actually, the aesthetical part of ecological policy, and of course, rooting it partially in Japanese culture, but also in Chinese one. And then I thought immediately about Taoism, and also contrasted it with the attitude of Mongols, who have very strong ecological sense, being close to the nature, but in more pragmatic way, how to preserve the natural environment and its functions, and less of aesthetical view. Of course, aesthetics is there, but it's not the core of the issue.
Mhm.
And I give example of Burultai, who was Inner Mongolian politician, and already in the 50s, she was trying to fight the certification of the grasslands in Ordos, physically
And
planting trees, if despite being an eminent politician. Thanks a lot. But thanks a lot for your publication, because actually I'm also working on that in the case of Mongolian areas in China and Mongolia. So that's great that you are sort of, you're an avant-garde of this writing. Thanks a lot for your book.
And Jesse, if I could just piggyback, because
Sure.
we're running out of time. I had a question that's related. On 189, you refer to the synthesizing ecology with socialist thought. And I wondered what is specifically socialist and or Chinese about the notion of ecological civilization, since you're also talking about it being taken up in other countries. And relatedly, if you have time, whether any of this accrues to sort of Chinese nationalist sentiment. But anyway, you can take that whole cluster and see what you do with it.
Yeah, I think first, thanks so much for thanks so much for both of these questions. And I should say, Catherine, Jiaqing, I invite you to jump in on these two. So because we're getting low on time, maybe I'll try to keep my responses somewhat brief. So thinking about situating ecological modernization in the urbanization campaign, as well as thinking about this squaring of ecological thought and socialist thought. So in the book, I try to draw out a picture where China's scientists are part of global discussions that are really trying to think about these things side by side. So how do we think about socialist industrial production, and how do we square that with what we know about ecology or ecological thought? And the Chinese scientists are having these conversations in all kinds of different subdisciplines within the natural and social sciences. So this is taking place in botany, agricultural economics, Marxist political economy, system science, et cetera. And they're having these conversations with folks in the United States, Eastern Europe, Japan. There's a kind of proliferation of discussion around this. And it becomes codified around the 1980s, largely in discussions between system scientists and Marxian political economists that essentially reorient the role of the peasantry. So if you think back, so what is socialist about it, and how is that shifting in the early reform era? If you think back to Maoist times, the peasantry was really at the forefront or the vanguard of revolutionary potential for political transformation. This was fundamental to Mao securing power. He essentially militarized this idea, which he learned from Li Dajiao and others, and used that to essentially obtain power and start the modernization project, one that was organized around the peasantry. And in the 1980s, as part of these global discussions by system scientists and political economists and others, this role of the peasantry is really reconfigured from the revolutionary vanguard to a kind of backwards social force that needs to be transformed from a predominantly rural, traditional agricultural production to a kind of mechanized large-scale industrial production, one that is kind of socio-spatially optimized in relationship to capital. So this is something that's kind of specific to this discussion, how this takes place and how it unfolds within China. If you think about the discussions from ecological Marxists and others from the 80s, 90s taking place elsewhere, places like the United States or Europe, the discussion looks somewhat different. But this is this kind of big break that you see in the 1980s that really orients a project of ecological modernization alongside a project of state-led urbanization. And these things essentially take place in tandem and become written into state policies largely from the 90s, 2000s onwards up to the present. So maybe I'll open it up for Catherine or Jiaqing if you want to say something also in relationship to those questions.
Either of you?
Catherine?
Yes or no? Sorry. Okay. I want to, did Tiona just leave? Shoot. I was trying to get to Tiona's question, but I think we just lost her. So you'll just have to save that one and get back to her, Jesse.
Sure.
Anyone who's on screen want to raise their hand? Otherwise, we are at time. And did someone want to add to what Jesse was just talking about? Okay. So, well, I would like to hear, actually, since Tiona's not here, we can talk about it informally afterwards. I think since it's 1:32, we should probably wrap up the formal session. Last call for anyone to raise their hands. Otherwise, thank you very much, Jesse. This was very rich discussion, and you really, you just got things so clear and interesting. Oh, there's David. David, you had a question. Should I read it for you? Can't hear you. I think you're muted. Okay, sorry, since David is still here and he's hung on despite driving in his car, I will let him get a chance to hear. He just wants to ask, does the Chinese state consider carbon emissions to be ugly, beautiful, or neither? If the first option is true, does the aesthetic give any leverage to climate movements in and about China? There's another sort of spin on
Yeah, maybe
aesthetic.
Jiaqing knows some more to say about this. I guess my thinking about this is that the Chinese state actually mechanizes things like air pollution to serve specific ends. So you can think about the notion of creating blue sky days, which the Chinese state did for the Beijing Olympics, which they did for the 2022 Olympics, which they do for large expos. They're really a process where the state turns on these kind of clanking gears of bureaucratic transformation and shuts down potentially polluting industries. They regulate the flow of traffic through the city, who can and cannot drive. And through these processes, actually create a kind of aestheticization of the sky to serve a particular kind of optic. And that, I think, is kind of fundamentally aesthetic in a way that relates to something like carbon emissions. But that's in a very kind of eventalist kind of way. I'm not sure if carbon emissions figure into the kind of aesthetic state formations in another kind of way. Jiaqing, maybe you have other thoughts on this because you look at these green industries too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a part. I was definitely thinking that as one aspect. I would say a general answer would be that it's neither, and it's depends on context and is really fundamentally about optimization, which, Jesse really powerfully shows is actually kind of the signal modern, eco-modernization kind of approach in China, that it's about, is the carbon fugitive or, out of time and place, or is it being optimized correctly? So you see this like in the work of Max Woodworth in his documenting of the transformation and concentration of the coal industry into larger state-owned industry, shutting down of smaller mines and so on, in order to optimize extraction and also to maintain supply while transforming landscapes for ecological planning and zoning purposes, and for setting labor and capital free for other purposes. And so China does not think carbon is ugly at this point, although it has the most ambitious targets for renewable energy deployment and actual implementation of those things on the industrial upstream side and on the downstream generation side out of any country. So in absolute terms, over the past couple of decades, it's become the leader in these things. And so I would say that really we need to look to the politics of what China, how it articulates across these many domains that Jesse lays out for us in his concept of ecological states. I'd say, yeah, definitely it's not one or the other at this point, but hopefully it may become so at some point. But then we come back to that final question about what such a vision, as it's projected through Chinese ecological state and potentially across national boundaries and globally, what it means for our own kind of ecological imaginaries that might be more liberatory. It's really the striking and disturbing puzzle that is across all the stories in Jesse's book.
Okay. With that, we're a little bit over time. Jesse, one more chance for any last words.
Thank you all for being
Okay.
here. Louisa, thank
Okay.
you. Judge and
Oh.
Catherine, thank you so much.
Yeah, my great pleasure. Very, very rich discussion. And there's Asher. Wow. Are you some faraway place? Aren't you on leave? Oh, yay. Thanks for coming. If anyone didn't get enough Q&A in there with Jesse, just write to him directly and keep the conversation going. And with that, Jesse, if you would stay on for a little bit of housekeeping,
Sure.
everyone else can sign off when they're ready. And thanks again. It's wonderful
I want to hear
conversation.
from Asher.